Welcome to the 2020 Karen Spärck Jones lecture. I'm delighted to be hosting this today, and we've got some terrific speakers for you. Really excited about that. Some housekeeping first. Please say hello in the chat. That would be delightful. If you've got questions that you want to ask, can you put those in the Q&A box, and that just helps us separate things out. That would be good. Our schedule today is we've got an introduction video from Professor Dame Wendy Hall, and we've got 3 fantastic speakers. They'll each do about 10 minutes each, one after the other with no breaks. So write down your questions, put them in the chat. We'll deal with the questions at the end. So once everybody's done a talk, then we'll do questions for about half an hour at the end, and we'll be all wrapped up at 5:30. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to hand over to pre-recorded Professor Dame Wendy Hall, who couldn't join us live today because she is a busy woman, but very illustrious woman in UK computing science.
Southampton, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Karen Spärck Jones Lecture 2022. This lecture is held in honour of Karen Spärck Jones, one of the most remarkable women in computer science. My script says she was a fellow of the British Academy. She had a long, rich and remarkable career as a pioneer of information science from the early days of computing. Actually, not many people really understand the impact that her work has had. Karen was the computer scientist responsible for the concept of inverse document frequency, IDF, and this technology underlies most modern search engines today. She should be much more widely regarded and known than she is. In fact, in 2019, the New York Times published a belated obituary in its series Overlooked, calling her a pioneer of computer science for work combining statistics and linguistics, and an advocate for women in the field. She was an expert in information retrieval and natural language processing and speech processing, did amazing things. And an advocate for women in the field, she certainly was. I was so privileged to have her as a mentor. She sort of took me under her wing and explained to me how the world worked. She was wise and wonderful and had a fantastic sense of humour. She could be very caustic if she wanted to be. She did not suffer fools gladly, but she was so helpful and so supportive, and a real role model for the sort of career I wanted to have. I miss her to this day, I really do. The BCS holds this annual lecture so that we can continue to honour women in computing research, and in particular Karen, of course. Women still only account for 20% of IT specialists, and the BCS are committed to making IT good for society. So it's our responsibility as members of the professional body for IT to ensure that professionals in our industry are representative and diverse, especially as the future talent pipeline emerges. Previous speakers in this series of lectures have included Professor Mirella Lapata from the University of Edinburgh, Professor Muffy Calder from the University of Glasgow, and Professor Maya Matarik from the University of Southern California. They're all on the website, and the lectures are recorded these days. In the very early days of the lectures, they weren't. And I was one of those early lecturers. I think I was the 2nd or 3rd in the series. I can't remember. I remember doing it at Imperial College many years ago, and being very proud to be part of the recognition of Karen that was being established through this series. This afternoon we're joined by 3 speakers who will all talk individually about their areas of research. They will then join a panel together where you will be able to ask them questions, and I think this is a really lovely way to take this lecture forward. So now I'd like to say a few words about our speakers. Our first is Dr Karen Renaud. Karen is a Scottish computing scientist working on all aspects of human-centred security and privacy. She was educated at the Universities of Pretoria, South Africa, and Glasgow. Her research is being funded by the Association of Commonwealth Universities, the Royal Society, the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Fulbright Commission. She is particularly interested in deploying behavioural science techniques to improve security behaviours and in encouraging end-user privacy-preserving behaviours. Her research approach is multidisciplinary, essentially learning from other more established fields and harnessing methods and techniques from other disciplines to understand and influence cybersecurity behaviours. Our second speaker this afternoon is Dr. Kelly Widdicks. Kelly is a lecturer in computer science at Lancaster University, specialising in sustainable and responsible digital technology. She is uniquely skilled in programming, quantitative and qualitative data analysis, human-computer interaction, and user experience research. Kelly has a passion for sustainability and equality, diversity and inclusion, and aims to drive the computing sector in ways which benefit society and the environment, and recently published a paper on the climate impacts of ICT, which is a very important topic for us all. And our third speaker this afternoon is Professor Lynn Kaack. I have no idea, Lynn, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Lynn is Assistant Professor of Computer Science and Public Policy at the Harty School. Her research and teaching focus on methods from statistics and machine learning to inform climate mitigation policy across the energy sector. And she also has an interest in climate-related AI policy. She's a co-founder and chair of the organisation Climate Change AI and a member of the Austrian Council on Robotics and Artificial Intelligence, which is an advisory board of the Austrian Ministry for Climate Action. Previously, she was postdoctoral researcher and lecturer in the Energy and Technology Policy Group at ETH Zurich. She obtained a PhD in engineering and public policy and a master's in machine learning from Carnegie Mellon University, as well as an MS and a BS in physics from the Free University of Berlin, one very qualified lady. I would now like to hand over to Karen Spärck, Professor of Computer Science at the University of Stirling and Chair of the BCS Women in Computing Research Group. And I'm looking forward to a wonderful afternoon of talks and then Q&A with you. Enjoy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Wendy. Wendy did the bit that I always forget to do, which was to introduce myself. So fortunately, she's done that for me. I think we slightly missed a little bit at the beginning. So just to say, Wendy is a Dame of the British Empire. She's an FRS, she's an FREng, she's Regis Professor of Computer Science at Southampton, and she's Associate Vice President of International Engagement there as well, and Executive Director of the Web Science Institute. And she has held many other roles and still does hold many other roles. So she's been, for example, the President of the ACM, the President of the BCS, and currently she is chair of the Ada Lovelace Institute. So we were very lucky that she had time to give us that introduction today. Just a quick reminder of the format. I see we've got a few people that have joined us. So each speaker is going to have about 10 minutes. I'm not going to be brutal about that. And if you've got questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A. We would love to see your questions, lots of them, and we'll do all of the questions at the end in a group. And if you've got questions that are just for one person or questions that are for the whole panel, if you maybe just flag that up in your question. Thank you very much. I'm going to now hand over to our first speaker, who is Karen Renaud, who is also in sunny Glasgow today.
Thank you. Right. Okay, I hope everyone can see my slides. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about nudge, sludge, and dark patterns, and this is where my interest in behavioral economics has come in, and just talk a little bit about a little study I've been involved in over the last few months. So firstly, to introduce the idea is that nudging was first proposed by Thaler and Sunstein. Thaler is a very well-known, respected behavioral economist who got a Nobel Prize for his work related to this nudge approach. So they make they give us very clear guidelines about what nudges are. They attempt to influence people towards a wiser option, by manipulating what we will call the choice architecture surrounding the behavior. So it's about where you're doing the behavior. They try to manipulate the environment. It's supposed to be implemented for the good of the person being nudged, which I will call the nudgee. And nudgees should agree with the rationale. So if they notice the nudge, they should be quite happy to be nudged in that direction. They should be convinced that this is a good thing for them. The other thing, there are some other things that Thaler and Sunstein point out, that you shouldn't take one of the pre-nudge options away. So, you know, by by forbidding one thing, that's not nudging, that's something different. You shouldn't pay people to do the one thing and then not pay them to do the other, because that introduces an economic incentive into it. You should understand enough about the human brain and about what you're doing in order to predict what option people should choose if you use a nudge. And finally, it has to be beneficial. If you ask the nudgee, do you want me to nudge? Do you think that you should be nudged in this direction? They should agree. So this is what we talk about, the choice architecture, and this one probably wouldn't work on someone like Homer Simpson, but the idea is that you put the fruit close and you keep the donuts far away. Now Homer can still have the donuts if he wants them, but it kind of makes the fruit more salient, and hopefully he will start to eat more healthily. And this is the idea behind the choice architecture. So there's some very famous ones. This is one of my favorites because none of the options are being taken away, but nobody wants to be called fat. And so therefore people will probably go up the steps. A very, very effective nudge. This is another nudge. Basically, the countries with the high bars on the right are countries where you are automatically opted in to allowing them to harvest your organs when you pass away. And the countries on the left with the little gray bars are countries where you have to deliberately opt in yourself. So you opt in, the other countries you have to opt out. And it's a simple thing like checking a box on a form. Pre-checking that box can have the effect that people will just leave it that way, and therefore those countries have a lot more organs in order to use for transplants. This one I have seen all over Glasgow. I don't know why it's so effective, but just all of us want to see a smiling face. Apparently that's hardwired in our brains, and so we slow down. This, I mean, you can still speed if you want to, but obviously we all like smiley faces. So this is a very effective one, and it's run by solar panels these days, so it doesn't even cost electricity. This one is at Schiphol Airport. It's in the men's toilet, so clearly I haven't seen it myself, but it puts a fly in. Apparently it helps to reduce spillage. Another very effective one, which doesn't cost anything apart from sticking a fly inside. Now, the idea behind the nudge is being fuzzy, warm, you know, paternalistic and all that sort of thing. But soon after the nudge idea emerged, people started to have reservations. And Cass Sunstein talks about nudging as libertarian paternalism, which is a bit of a mouthful, but trying to persuade us that it's not really paternalism because we're not removing any of the pre-nudge options. But some people do have a concern that it's becoming going a little bit too far, and that we're just all being played like puppets. And so there's a sense that sometimes a nudge becomes a shove. And well, so I'm not going to talk about that much today, but there's a fine line about where nudging is ethical and where it becomes unethical, as in becoming a shove, or becoming ineffective because you haven't really designed it very well. Now, on the right-hand side, Cass Sunstein, one of the authors of the original nudge book, wrote a book called Sludge, which is very interesting. And this is about, of course, where bad actors are using these same techniques that are supposed to be used for good, and then they turn them on us and use them for their benefit instead of for ours. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, the nudge unit or the behavioral insights unit in London, which was put in place by David Cameron, I believe. They were very much involved with the British government in trying to scare the British public during the pandemic. And now there's an investigation by MPs because they didn't have any idea about how to ratchet back the fear. And a lot of people have really suffered from this level of fear being used. So the idea is that, you know, maybe this nudge unit used fear, and that probably wasn't ethical, but we'll see what the MPs decide. Now, Sludge is when the persuasion and these kind of techniques are used on you, but it's not for your interest, it's for the interest of the company in this case. So this is a quite common page that you can see when you go and book some travel or a hotel or something. And there's actually 5 or 6 different kinds of sludge on this page. So the first one is it's recommended. So that means that other people like this as well, this kind of trip. And therefore, we are very susceptible to what other people are doing. We take our cues from other people. The next one is you can see that the yes, I do want to have that protection plan is much, much bigger than the no, which is even in a kind of a grayed out font underneath. So you're probably more likely to click on the yes. They also tell you how many other customers have bought this in the last 7 days. And who knows if that's even an accurate number. Oh no, it's okay. I'm planning to risk my money that I've just paid. And another thing that we're very, very averse to is losing things. People feel losses much more keenly than they feel gains. Somebody got the money back when she cancelled their flight. So in one page, you can see 5 lots of quite devious techniques if you think about it. So this one, I took a screenshot. I have got to be very clear that Ryanair doesn't do this anymore, but they did do this, where basically if you didn't want to buy their insurance, you had to click on country of residence and go halfway down to say, no, I actually don't want it. So it was hidden halfway down. It's very, very sludgy. But they've stopped doing it now. So, all kudos to them for realizing that they shouldn't do things like this. I recently went onto a particular website to buy some stamps. And when I was wanting to get through from the checkout to go and pay, it was really trying very hard for me to enter the car giveaway. You can see that the big green button, but at the bottom, didn't even look like a button, click on proceed without entering. So once again, I don't know why they're so keen. I knew I wasn't going to win their giveaway, but maybe they wanted to charge me a bit more, but I resisted this with all my might. There's a man called Harry Brignall who's put up a wonderful website called the Dark Patterns, a Hall of Shame. And so I can explain a few more to you. This one is called Sneak into Basket. So basically you want to buy something and then they stick the $2.99 extra little bit into your basket. And if you're not paying attention, you will probably, you'll just click on the continue and pay and then realize that accidentally you bought this extra thing. This is one called Confirm Shaming. And you can see they really, really want you to sign up and pay for a newsletter. And at the bottom saying, no, I like paying more than I need to. So this is kind of shaming you into not wanting to do what they want you to do. This is one called Roach Motel. I've encountered this one myself, where it's really easy to subscribe to something, but when you don't want it anymore, you actually have to phone a number and wait for half an hour for a human being to tell them. And then they try to persuade you to stay, keep the subscription. This is, so it's easy to get in, very hard to get out of. This one is the only one named after a human being. Privacy Zuckering, basically manipulating you into giving far more information than you really know you ought to be giving them. And as you see who it's named after. Now, the thing we wanted to look at was children these days, especially since the pandemic, are online for hours a day. They are often unsupervised, especially if parents have more than one child that they've got to help with schoolwork while they were working from home. And what we were wondering was, do the children see and know about sludge? Because as adults, we probably would spot a lot of those things ourselves, but do the kids know what's going on? And the whole idea is, forewarned is forearmed, because as soon as I started reading this literature, I became so much more aware of these techniques. And I'm not going to claim that I see all of them, but I'm much more attuned to when somebody's trying to manipulate me. And so what we were wondering was, what about these, what we call young learners? We want to be able to forewarn and forearm them, but we first need to know where they are just now. What is the baseline right now? Now, our focus was on young learners aged 11 to 12, because the research literature tells us that it is at this age that they're venturing out, becoming more autonomous, not really consulting their parents as much anymore, but consulting their friends. But they don't yet have the skills to protect themselves both online and offline. So this is a dangerous age to be manipulated and taken in. So I'm working with 6 very wonderful collaborators, as you see, at 6 other universities. It's been a very valuable collaboration because they all bring something different to the table. And we designed workshops. Now, because we did these workshops during the pandemic, we weren't allowed to go into classrooms. So what we did was we did everything via Teams, and we kept the cameras off. So a lot of what you see here is about ethics, because these are working with children, and we have to make sure that they're protected. And so we gave the teachers, really clear guidelines. We gave the teachers some scenarios so they could print it on pieces of paper, and they put it down for the children. And then we asked the children, so what would happen if you clicked on this link? And just to see if they got it. Now, you'll see I've put an arrow there towards draw and explain. Previously, people have used drawings to understand children's mental models. But we wanted to triangulate. Now, in an ideal world, we would have been in the classrooms and we could have observed the children drawing. We couldn't do that, but what we did do was ask the teacher to let the child come to the computer, and then we could talk to them and ask them questions, and they would say what they thought was going to happen, and then we'd draw them out and ask them, so why do you think that would happen? Who do you think is doing this kind of thing? So we really could get to how much do these kids really understand about online deception, and where do we need to design an intervention to really forewarn and forearm them. And we did 7 different workshops, and very, very valuable experience. So this was the very first one. We couldn't resist using privacy zuckering. And the other thing was there's a cryptocurrency at the moment that if you allow them to scan your retina, they will give you a whole bunch of cryptocurrency. And we just thought that, children might not realize that their eyeballs or their retinas are valuable, and would they just accept this and go for it? The second one was what is called bait and switch, which we're all familiar with. You're looking at your Facebook page or something, and then there's a little thing saying, oh, would you like some free Robux? Now, apparently Robux is a game that all the kids really like to play, so that would be quite tempting for them. And you can see the little arrow we've added to the scenarios to say, okay, what would happen if you clicked there? This one is, you've all probably seen this. You go into a YouTube video and then suddenly you get an advert. And we just wanted the kids to understand, would the kids really understand what would happen if you clicked on one of those little boxes there? And then the final one is this one, which is actually a genuine warning. And I don't know if you can notice there, it's privacy, it's Instagram.con. And we wondered whether the kids would notice that. And that's probably why the warning is coming, because this is not the real website. But would the kids understand that this was a genuine warning? And then secondly, what would they tell us what would happen if they actually clicked on advance anyway? What could happen? So we had these scenarios. We showed the children. We asked them to draw pictures about the next 3 things that they thought would happen for each scenario if someone were to click on that link. And then we asked them, we spoke to them. 2 volunteer kids got up and they chatted to us about what they thought. So here's an example of one of the drawings we got. It's kind of a strange order. You start at the bottom, then you go up, and then you go to the right. And my eye will be leaked towards a link I haven't researched on, all for some scam. So they get the idea that this is probably a scam, but they don't really get the privacy aspects of it, but that's good. They got the idea. And then that it would ask them for their email and their date of birth. So this was what we saw. They're very attuned to their information is personal, and they shouldn't just hand it out to everybody. And that was really good to see 11-year-old kids knowing that already. Here's another one. Again, this one goes top to bottom and then goes to the right, and you can see that the word scam. The word scam was mentioned all the time. The kids really get that. But this one is the amazing kid at Gmail. I just loved working with these kids. And then these are some comments that I just thought were brilliant. This is the 11-year-old children remember saying, we're not that gullible. I was thinking, wow, these are going to be amazing when they grow up. And then the second one, quite suspicious, saying, why would they want to see my eye? No game has ever asked me for this before. Why should I have to scan? And then the last one saying, well, maybe there's this high-tech thing and it will catch your whole computer if you click on it. So they, we just learned so much. And unfortunately, we've only just run the workshop, so I haven't got total final findings to tell you about, but I can tell you a little bit about initial impressions. We discovered that these kids are very, very attuned to online scams, the possibility that somebody's trying to trick them. They focus a lot on protecting their information and their accounts being taken over and all their game gems or something being stolen. So somebody has been telling these kids a lot of good information, probably their schools, their parents, they are getting that information. But they're almost hyper attuned. The warning was considered to be a scam. They immediately looking for a scam all the time, maybe because we were doing the workshop and they thought, okay, you know, this must be bad because the others that they saw had been bad. And they do not really have a sense of why people might want to be doing this apart from stealing their information. And the other thing we realized was they didn't really know what to do if something did go wrong with their computer or their account was taken over. It would just be, oh, well, that's the end game. And so we can see that there is a need for a little bit of an intervention to take them just a little bit further from having the radar out all the time, which is great. But everybody can get hacked, and you know, even if you're really, really careful. And so just giving them more of those tools would be very helpful. So this research was funded by Sprite, and just to thank them for their funding, we have published 2 papers so far. The first was a white paper on you know, what these dark patterns are about and why children might be susceptible to them. And then we developed a very special methodology for doing the workshops, because it was fairly new, somebody trying to do this kind of research remotely and not being in the classroom. So we developed that, and we thought it might be helpful for other folks to be able to use the benefits of our experiences and challenges in doing this research. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy if anybody would like to get in touch to send you any papers that we publish about this research in the future. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Karen. I'm going to just move straight on to Kelly, because I could get really sidetracked by talking about that already. But Kelly, can I call upon you to share your screen? Brilliant. Over to you.
There we go. I was trying to find the unmute button. So yeah, it was such an interesting talk, Karen. Thank you for that. Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Kelly Widdicks. We had the introductions before, but I'm from Lancaster University. Thank you very much for having me here to speak today. My background is in computer science and particularly sustainable human-computer interaction. But today I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I've been doing with my colleagues here on the climate impact of ICT. So this work was done with my colleagues Bran, Gordon and Adrian in the School of Computing at Lancaster University, as well as Mike Berners-Lee's Small World Consulting and Charlotte Freitag at that organisation as well. So yeah, all about the climate impact of ICT. So just for some context, what do I mean by ICT? I mean information communication technology. I'm thinking about the kind of devices that we have in our pockets, like mobile phones and tablets, and then also larger devices like laptops, but also things like games consoles, smart TVs, and the technology that sits behind all this, like data centers and the networks that you might not initially think of. And also things like artificial intelligence and blockchain and the Internet of Things. And this all underpins our society. And ICT creates an environmental impact at each stage of its life cycle. And by this, I mean the embodied emissions released from the extraction of raw materials required for those technologies, as well as the manufacturing processes and the transport to the business and the user. I then mean the use phase emissions, so the operational emissions from energy use and maintenance of that technology. And then the end of life emissions when we dispose of digital technology. And in this work, we aim to explore what ICT's emissions actually are. So just to give a really brief overview of the method, because it's always a kind of boring bit, but we critiqued literature searches for peer-reviewed studies on the carbon footprint of ICT, particularly digging deeper into the main estimates and debates in the area. And we kind of found that there was 3 key analysts in the field called Anders André, Jens Malmödin and Lotfi Belkir. So we followed up with kind of consultation with these key experts as well. And we utilised some research done by Small World Consulting on carbon accounting. So in investigating ICT's environmental impacts, we found that there are actually quite limited studies that estimate the whole of the ICT sector's emissions, and these don't come to a consensus. So instead, the estimates range between 1.8 and 2.8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And these contrasts due to the use of different data sources for carbon calculations, the recency of the data used for those calculations, and also due to the different decisions about what kind of classes, as in scope of ICT's impacts. So this includes kind of what I was just talking about then about what actually is ICT. So what types of digital technologies to include. So whether television or blockchain classes as ICT, as well as elements of what carbon footprint to consider. So scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And we actually found that all of these kind of estimates underestimate the true environmental impact of ICT because of these differences, but also due to what is called a truncation error, where ICT's full supply chain emissions are not considered in carbon accounting. And actually taking truncation error into account, we put the real share of global emissions for ICT is actually somewhere between 2.1 and 3.9% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is actually comparable to the aviation industry. We also found that these estimates fail to account for the activities of ICT innovators and end users that conflict with energy efficiency gains in ICT, for example, kind of novel device development or intensive device use. So that's kind of the current kind of estimates for ICT environmental impacts now. But when you analyse the studies projecting ICT's future environmental impact, there are even more profound differences in what they predict. And in researching this, we found that the projections vary because they are dependent on the number of underlying assumptions, which are sometimes, but not always, made explicit. So there's 6 here. I'm just going to kind of look at 3 of them today. Firstly, on kind of will efficiency gains reduce ICT's carbon footprint? Is ICT reducing carbon savings or making carbon savings in other industries? And will renewable energy decarbonize ICT? So the first assumption to consider is whether energy efficiencies in ICT are reducing ICT's carbon footprint. So efficiency has continued to improve in ICT, and some experts actually argue that there's been huge efficiency gains and carbon savings in data centers, despite the fact that global compute instances have risen significantly. However, if you look at that historical data, the demand for more computations and the number of digital devices per person has actually outpaced efficiency improvements. And this results in ICT's energy consumption and carbon footprint growing year on year. And this is a pattern explained through what is called a rebound effect, where ICT's introduction or efficiency can actually lead to an increase in emissions overall. One of the biggest debates is whether ICT is enabling carbon savings in other industries. So the Global E-Sustainability Initiative suggests that the use and efficiencies of ICT for other sectors, such as food and transport, could enable a 20% saving in global emissions. And a classic example of how ICT could be seen to create emission savings is through video conferencing technologies, like what we've got doing now. So allowing people to meet virtually instead of using kind of physical transport like aviation. However, there's quite little evidence in the past that efficiencies have led to a decrease in global emissions, and instead they've risen hand in hand with each other. So it would be risky to assume that ICT would start to introduce emission savings now. Rather, it's more likely that ICT is creating rebound effects in other sectors, so leading to this emissions growth in the sectors that it actually introduces those efficiency gains. So if we take that video conferencing example again, video traffic has increased rapidly and the emissions from flights have increased too. So ICT is not a substitute here, it's added alongside travel. There's also a question on whether renewable energy will decarbonize ICT. So renewable energy has a much lower carbon footprint than fossil fuel energy, and the ICT sector are great in the fact that they're actually leading the way in the investment and the global shift to renewable energy. And some experts actually expect that ICT's carbon footprint could be reduced by up to 80% through renewables. However, renewable energy itself has a significant carbon footprint embedded in its infrastructure and supply chains. And there are limited resources such as silver required for solar energy panels that limit renewables. And focusing renewables on digital technology actually also removes the ability of other sectors to decarbonize. So do we choose kind of renewables for ICT over something like heating our homes? So while the shift to renewables is paramount, it does not mean that we have an unlimited supply of energy for ICT to just expand without consequences. And whatever position that the analysts that we looked at take on these crucial questions, on these assumptions, they all note that ICT will not reduce its emissions without major concerted efforts involving broad political and industrial action. So under the business as usual, actually the most optimistic projection of ICT's future carbon footprint is just staying stable at the current level. And if it did stay stable, then we would have something like what's shown on the graph here. So the blue part on the graph represents non-ICT sectors' global CO2 emissions from now until 2050, if they decrease in line with 1.5 degrees of warming, in line with the Paris Agreement. And the orange part represents ICT's emissions if they stayed stable. And if ICT's emissions did stay stable, then the relative share of ICT's emissions would increase to more than a third of global emissions. So there's quite a big debate here to be had around whether ICT can form this significant share if it is seen as a way to green the economy, if it actually can reduce emissions elsewhere. But so far it would be kind of risky to assume that ICT saves more emissions than it contributes. And we actually need kind of more transparent evidence on this. So that's kind of looking at if emissions stay stable, but we actually think that there are 3 reasons that ICT environmental impacts will increase. Firstly, because of this historic trend of ICT's efficiencies increasing alongside emissions in the ICT sector and the global economy. Secondly, because of the main studies in this area make quite important emissions on the growth trends of ICT, so not considering things like artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and blockchain. And there's actually quite a lot of investment in these trends as a way to green society. So in light of these considerations, it'd be risky to assume that ICT will by default assist in the attainment of climate targets. There's some positive news that large digital technology leaders in industry have made some climate pledges, but we need net zero emissions targets, and few aim for this already. So we need to make sure that they're on track to meet on targets as well. There's also a focus on renewables and carbon offsets, and I've just explained some of the issues around renewables, but for carbon offsetting, there are also issues around making sure that these mechanisms are truly additional, so that the organisation actually does directly remove the carbon that they've put into the atmosphere. And finally, there's been a net zero target with guidance set out by the International Telecommunications Union for the ICT sector, which was approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative, but this is voluntary currently. So what are the key takeaways? Well, ICT is currently seen as a way to green the economy, but ICT has an environmental impact too. And this could be as much as the aviation industry. So there's a huge risk that ICT could kind of impact our ability to meet climate targets. We need consistent, transparent evidence on ICT's environmental impacts. So ensuring that all ICT organizations are taking the same calculation approaches that are fully inclusive of all the emission scopes, and making sure that this data is available so that it can be independently scrutinized. And ICT will not reduce its emissions in line with the Paris Agreement without major concerted efforts involving broad political and industrial action, which we urgently need across the sector. So there's still so much to understand about ICT's environmental impact, particularly around the trends in ICT in artificial intelligence, and particularly how to bring the sustainable and responsible design of technologies into practice for ICT organizations. So that's kind of the next scope of our research. We started this project, Paris DE, in September. So very, very happy to talk more about that, or there's a link on the slide if you're interested. Yes, so thank you very much for listening to my talk. If you're interested in any further detail in what we've spoken about, then there is this work was published at Patterns as well. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kelly. But terrifying stuff.
Just trying to find how to end my sharing.
Stop sharing. Yes. And our final speaker today is also going to talk to us about ICT and climate change, and that is Lynn Kaack. Now, Kelly, I think you're still sharing. Oh, okay, well done.
Great. All right, can you see?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Over to you, Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you. And it was really nice to see the two previous talks, and I think they set up, I mean, the order works really well, because this last talk maybe touches on both of these aspects, and especially Kelly, I think I'm glad that you went into so much detail on the direct emissions of ICT, because for time reasons, I sort of omitted them from my talk, so I'm happy to bring that to the discussion round as well. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about how AI and climate change, and in particular machine learning and climate change, relate to one another. And this has been based on various strands of my work. So it has to do with my research, but it also has to do with an organization that I co-founded called Climate Change AI. And some of the reports and papers that we wrote in that work. So largely, we can think of this intersection in three different ways. So there are AI applications in climate change mitigation and adaptation. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to a changing climate. And I'm going to go into more detail on these in this talk. But then AI can also, of course, increase emissions and create additional vulnerabilities, because it's a multi-purpose tool. It can be applied in all kinds of settings. And this can be, for example, through the way it's applied, but also through the way that the system sort of reacts to these new technologies. So there's sometimes very indirect ways that AI may affect emissions. And then lastly, there's this aspect of compute-related emissions that we heard about in detail just now. So I'm really glad that we covered this. And AI, of course, just makes up a fraction of ICT emissions, but it might be a fast-growing fraction. And we actually don't have the numbers today to understand like what portion of the ICT emissions are due to AI and how fast they're growing. So we just know how fast the models are growing, but we really don't understand the usage patterns well enough to estimate like the big picture of the total emissions of AI. Okay, so I wanted to provide some more detail on how we can use AI to help with mitigation and adaptation. And around 2 years ago, I published a paper together with a number of different authors, a lot of them from the machine learning community, and we asked ourselves, how can machine learning skills be used to help address climate change? And from that large paper, it has around 60 pages of different applications in various different sectors. We sort of extracted some overarching themes, how one can think about machine learning in this context. And I'm going to walk you through really quickly what these kind of themes are. So the first one is improving forecasting, and that's something that's that is currently being used in the electricity sector, for example, especially I think the UK National Grid is really proactive in using machine learning to help, for example, forecast renewable energy production. So solar and wind are very weather dependent and vary quite a bit over the course of a day or a year. So machine learning techniques can be really useful for improving these forecasts by sourcing, new kinds of data sources such as images, but also by just improving the way we can model actually the output dependent on the weather. But similar approaches are also being used in transportation systems. So forecasting, for example, the arrival times, so demands in public transportation systems, or even in large-scale weather modeling and climate modeling to understand when extreme events may occur. Machine learning and AI technologies are also being used to improve the operational efficiency of systems. So for example, heating and cooling systems in houses or in large industrial facilities can be optimized with the help of AI approaches. And there's actually quite a large potential for increasing energy efficiency in these systems. And those sometimes coupled with other kinds of ICT technologies, these are lumped together as smart home technologies, but they're really also being used in industrial contexts and can generate quite some efficiency gains here. Same goes for transportation systems, but approaches like these are even used to reduce food waste, for example, in supply chains. Then an area that is rather mundane, I guess, boring, is predictive maintenance, but it's an area that has been widely used in practice already. So companies are using machine learning based approaches to maintain their infrastructure and their systems. For example, many railway companies are actually looking towards these methods and are also deploying these methods to extract information about failures or predict when failures might occur on their systems, and that can both lower the cost but also make systems more reliable, and that can actually help to make, for example, rail a reliable solution for low carbon transportation. The same also goes for creating more resilient infrastructure as the climate is changing in particular. So these predictive maintenance approaches are really already widely used in practice. Then machine learning is also used to speed up scientific experimentation. For example, by helping to find better batteries or next generation clean energy materials. And here it's being used to search over databases of previous experiments and characteristics of potential new experimental configurations to speed up the process in the lab. And machine learning is also integrated with simulation models, for example, in climate science, or even for city planning, where people understand how wind flows around newly designed districts, and they can do so in a much shorter amount of time if you actually use machine learning, for example, to emulate a model. And I wanted to dive a bit deeper into gathering information with machine learning, which is a topic that is closer to my research. So the idea here, for example, is that we can use data sources such as satellite images to create databases that are being used by decision makers. So this is an example of a recent study, which is not my own study, but I wrote a commentary on that piece. And this is the first study that scanned the entire globe for large-scale solar, so utility scale or industrial scale solar PV installations. And this is answering a need for better data on distributed energy technologies and energy infrastructure. But we can not only use this on satellite images, but also text data can be analyzed much better with the help of machine learning. And actually, this fits really well, I think, in the context of Karen Spärck Jones' work on natural language processing. So here in this example from my own research, we analyzed or we trained on our own labeled data and then analyzed around 5,000 annual reports of corporations based on and trying to figure out where they talk about climate-related risks. So both the risks that they might experience due to changing climate, but also the market or technology risks they might face as we decarbonize the economy. With that, we could analyze many more reports than one could manually read and label. And we can actually show the developments over time. So in this plot, which is the result of our analysis, you can see how the number of risk disclosures per report are drastically increasing over the past years, and that transition risk actually dominate physical risk in this context. And by having more information about how companies talk about their risk, one can also understand then how policy approaches, for example, are effective in certain contexts, and how maybe the financial sector is also getting more sensitive to climate change. Yeah, so I also worked on framing impact assessment of machine learning more generally, and that touches also on the previous lecture that we heard. This is from a working paper that recently got accepted, and here we sort of framed the direct, so the compute-related impacts of machine learning, and the indirect, what we call here immediate application impacts or system-level impacts of machine learning. And what we wanted to display here is that the compute-related impacts are largely affected by also how machine learning algorithms are designed. But they're sort of well contained and can also be much easier measured. But then there's this whole spectrum of application areas and associated impacts that can be both negative and positive. And we actually have issues here assessing, really quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions from machine learning in this context. I was also part of writing a report for the Global Partnership on AI, where we laid out policy recommendations for governments to help align AI with climate goals. And here we particularly focused on those this application area. So AI is a tool for climate action, which I talked about today. But we also give recommendations how one could think about AI's impact more holistically, and also try approaches to contain or hold accountable for the application areas where it might actually increase emissions. And central pillars here are incorporating responsible AI with climate change or climate action to build capacity in the right places. And also international collaboration plays a big role for fostering AI applications in this area. And then lastly, we also lay out a roadmap, sort of how to proceed towards a better impact assessment in this area. And I'm almost finished, but I wanted to briefly touch on what the organization that I co-founded does. So we wrote this long paper about all the different application areas of machine learning, and then noticed that there's really a need to create sort of a space at this intersection where climate change experts and machine learning experts can meet and exchange ideas and also start collaborating. So we are running, we've run many workshops at the large AI conferences, so ICML in Europe, ICLAIR, AMD, and we've also ran events at the COP, the two previous COPs, so the climate conferences, the UN climate conferences. We also ran two events in Glasgow last year. We have our own innovation grants program, and we are setting up a summer school that is going to be the first one piloted this summer. And we also have regular webinars. We have online spaces. So if you're interested in meeting people or seeing more about the latest research in this area, feel free to check it out. And with that, I would like to thank you, and here are my contact details in case you want to reach out.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lynn. That was really great. You've all been terrific. I can't overstate, how nice it is to hear from all of you and the interesting things that are going on in your research at the moment. So thank you all very much for giving us the time to give us talks. I'm going to turn now to the panel discussion section of the lecture today. There are some questions already in the chat. I'm just going to start at the top. We've got one for Karen, and Douglas asks, how would the children's responses compare with other age groups, perhaps?
Well, this is a very good point. We decided that we wanted to target children so that we would get adults who were more resistant to online nefarious activities. But obviously, we need also to target other age groups. For people who work, who are in employment, generally get this kind of training at work. But folks who are not in employment or folks who've already retired, these are the people who are really vulnerable. So this is a first of a few studies. I think I've already been approached by another researcher to ask if they can use our workshop and our materials to work with a group of senior citizens, and I'm definitely going to be participating in that as well.
Yeah, that sounds really brilliant, because you used the phrase digital natives earlier on, and of course, perhaps those young kids are much more savvy about these risks than the other end of the population. They
blew us away, quite frankly. We were not expecting them to be so amazing, but they were.
Yeah, it sounds like it, actually. Really good. And I've got a question for Kelly from Pat Keane. And Pat is asking, did the calculations take into account cybercrime? I think this is the calculations on emissions.
Yes, so well, I guess when the analysts look at the carbon footprint of ICT, they're very much looking at kind of the devices, not necessarily always the services and the things that happen across those. So I can't be sure, but I assume yes, because obviously we looked at the internet, but I don't know how much it tracks things like on the dark web, etc. So yeah, I would say probably.
Seems like a fair answer. And I've got a second one for you actually as well. There's a long question from Greenaway. I don't know who Greenaway's first name is. Is there ultimately a trade-off to be made regarding consumer and corporate demand, along with Moore's law for technological growth targets, which strive for infinite growth and a drive towards renewable energy and recycling or environmental strategies, especially to extend the life of technology? What is your personal assessment of balancing these conflicting interest areas?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really good point, and certainly one that we battle with a lot in that sense, in terms of yeah, I mean, a lot of these things that we kind of talk about in terms of what you should do for the environment in terms of keeping your devices for longer, etc., it's really hard to do under current kind of business models. So you might have like your classic mobile provider that offers you a contract, and then you get the device, and after a year and a half or 2 years they want you to get the new device and the latest iPhone or other products. So yeah, there is kind of conflicts with business kind of things that they want to do. So that's why kind of the efficiencies focus, I guess, has been so far on that side, and renewable energies. But I think it's great that the ICT sector is kind of paving that way for renewables. But I think in terms of moving forward from this, there is a kind of moral obligation for businesses. We also have, lots of countries that have signed up to the Paris Agreement, and that's going to filter through from high level policy down to different sectors. So yeah, I think policy is kind of the way that we'll start to actually consider these more deeply.
Thank you. That leads me nicely onto a question that I had for Lynn, actually, because I thought that an emphasis in your talk, Lynn, was very much about that policy engagement. And I wondered, if you've got any recommendations for that, because I think it can be quite hard as scientists to have those conversations with policymakers. So obviously your organisation, Climate Change AI, is managing to do that very successfully, I would say. So have you got any secret tips that you could share with us?
Yeah, so climate change AI is actually being reached out to more than anything. So it's also, we don't do lobbying in that sense, but it's more like a resource, and it has been kind of in almost a passive way that entities have reached out to us. But we also, of course, have a very large network. So it probably comes through that, I think. But what that shows is that there is a huge need for information, for expert advice in this area. And as probably many of you know, the EU is revising right now the AI Act, or they are shaping the AI Act, which is the first sort of its kind regulation for artificial intelligence. And there are a lot of like big scale movements on the policy side that also require a lot of technical expertise. So I think there is a need for scientists to step up and to be available. Then the mechanism is always, you don't know, right? I mean, the policy space is just such a mysterious personal network kind of thing that you never know like where people found your names and where they reach out. But yeah, it happens quite a bit in the space, especially right now. Then my own research is focused on science and technology advice to policymakers. So it also helps sort of to have a policy profile and be in a policy school, I think, personally. I don't know if I have any good advice. It depends on exactly what's your question, like how to talk to them. I think just be available, listen to their questions, provide them with material. It's all very also short-lived and fast-paced, I would say. And you never know exactly who will use your information for what. Yeah, I think that's sort of something to be expected.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you very much, Lynn. I'm going to use my privileged position to also turn that question to Karen, because I can see that there'd be really interesting potential policy impacts of your work, Karen, on nudges and sludges. Yeah. So have you engaged with any of that sort of work?
No, I haven't engaged. I would love to engage with policy work, but we've worked a lot with the Scottish Education, who are very interested in this research and definitely want to know more about it. You know, actually all of the workshops took place in Scottish schools. So yes, we would like to engage with policymakers to make sure that children are more prepared for the online world, because they were sort of catapulted into it with the beginning of the pandemic without any of the policies being in place. And we are also engaging with schools in terms of how they write the policies because policies can also have an educational function in informing children about how to behave online as well. So yes, of course, these are the things that once you've done the research and you've got the evidence, you can show it to them and they become very interested.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you very much. We've got some more questions from the audience. One from Philip Wadler. Hi, Phil. He used to lecture me when I was an undergraduate. Cryptocurrency is infamous for its negative climate impact. Will shifting from proof of work to proof of stake solve this particular problem, or will other climate issues with cryptocurrency remain? That's one for Kelly.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a great question, Phil. That's certainly a big area of where ICT's kind of emissions or trends in ICT that will be growing in terms of its carbon footprint. In terms of moving from that proof of work to proof of stake algorithm, I know that the proof of stake algorithm is more, less energy intensive. But there's been kind of studies around, obviously from our work, it's not just about that kind of use phase emissions, it's also the emissions associated with actually creating the technology itself in the first place. So and things like to use blockchain, which cryptocurrencies run on. You need kind of specific software or specific devices for that software. So these can't really be repurposed for other uses in that sense. And also, I know there's been work done. I can't quite remember then at DeVries, I think it is, who has been kind of exploring Bitcoin's energy problem, and they've been highlighting that a lot of Bitcoin mining occurs in certain regions in China where there's a kind of reliance on fossil fuel energy. So yeah, it becomes quite tricky to kind of just focus on that change to the different algorithm.
Super. Thank you very much. Questions flooding in now. I'm going to go for one for all panelists. I'm going to start with Lynn, just so you can heads up. I'll do Lynn and then Kelly and then Karen. How did you embark on a research career into these areas? And this is somebody who's asking as a current university student, and they're really inspired to see so many women in IT.
Okay, yeah, my route was maybe not the typical computer science, because I have one computer science degree, but mainly I studied physics, and my PhD is in engineering and public policy, so it's a little bit all over the place. I decided pretty early on that I wanted to work on climate change mitigation, and I always had this quantitative STEM interest already in school, and then out of lack of alternatives and based on liking physics, I just studied physics essentially, and then pivoted in my PhD to working on energy and climate change mitigation. During my PhD, I sort of couldn't stop doing homeworks and like doing this kind of drill from physics. So I actually took one stats class after the other, and that's how I got to machine learning, because that's such a big topic at Carnegie Mellon. And that wasn't the plan originally. It just happened because you got all this great teachers there. And machine learning is really also felt in all kinds of departments there as a component, and people do research, like interdisciplinary research with machine learning. So that's sort of how the whole machine learning component came into my work. Yeah, I guess I had an idea what I wanted to do with my career, but then how everything came together was luck and, you know, just walking some path, I guess.
Kelly.
Yeah, so this was into ICT, into studying this particular area, right? So
yes, what sort of inspired you to get into that area?
So I guess so I did a computer science undergraduate degree, and as part of that, in our third year, we have a undergraduate research project. And my supervisor was basically, my supervisor at the time, basically advertised a research project in sustainability and ICT, and I hadn't really kind of ever considered the two in tandem. I'd already thought about ICT supporting maybe society and the environment, not really considering ICT's environmental footprint itself. So yeah, I ended up going into that, and I left university, went and be a software engineer for a while, and then kind of missed that excitement of actually kind of doing something that was not meaningful, because the software engineering was meaningful, but in a different way, but actually kind of focusing on something that I really truly cared about. So yeah, came back and studied this more deeply in my PhD. So yeah, probably like Lynn, a little bit of some coincidences and some role models in that sense.
Yes, but serendipity seems to be a focus here. And finally, Karen, how did you?
How did I get into nudging and sludging? Right. So yeah. I go way back, obviously. I started my career as a software engineer. I wrote software in languages that nobody here has probably even heard of, because they sort of died. And I loved it. So I love to develop software. I love to do software engineering and systems analysis and all those wonderful things. But then I created a piece of software one day, and I was working, strangely enough, for an iron ore mine. And we delivered the software, and I thought, oh my gosh, this wonderful, wonderful thing I've created. And this man looked at me and said, I'm not using that. And that was a real shock for me, because I thought he would see how wonderful this was. And that started waking me up to the fact that we have humans here and we have to understand humans if we're going to do anything properly. So I moved over to thinking about humans. And then around the turn of the century, the cybersecurity reared its head. And I thought, right, that's what I want to do. I want to look at how humans and cybersecurity meet. And we went for a long time into psychology, very heavily into the psychology. But then when behavioral economics came in, I thought, wow, this is the thing. This is going to help people to behave securely. Of course, whenever you come up with a new way of doing things, the bad guys will also take it and use it against us, which is where my interest in nudge and sludge and dark patterns came in. And the whole world was really taken in by the whole nudging approach. And it's sort of, for me, a sign now of the times about a question about whether we do this ethically or how to do nudging ethically. And I think a lot of people are just like a wild west out there with the nudging, whereas it's maybe a field that's needing to start maturing, and we need to start understanding, when do we go over into the shoving? When do we go over into the deceptive? Because none of us want to behave that way. And so that's what's really interesting for me now, is trying to find that point where what I'm doing is right as a researcher, and I'm not going into the shoving, and I'm not going into that unethical.
Thank you very much. I think, looking at where the time is, I'm going to ask you another question that's for all three of you. And in her introduction, Dame Wendy said something about how Karen Spärck Jones had taken her under her wing and showed her how the world worked. It made me think about how important it is to have that person. Well, I think it's important to have that person that you can engage with early on, that gives you that kind of perspective. I certainly, for me, I would say that that person was very much my PhD supervisor, who is still somebody I turn to today for advice, and she tries to tell me how the world works. I'm not sure I always listen. So I wondered, for you, is there somebody that you would say really shaped where your career is today and helped you figure out how the world worked? And maybe what's your top tip that you would pass on to somebody in terms who's a young woman particularly getting into tech, what you would like to pass on to them that's going to help them in their careers? I am going to start with Kelly this time, and then I'll come to Karen, and I'll finish with Lynn.
Got the hard job of going first.
Sorry, Kelly.
That's good. Yeah, I don't know if there's kind of one particular person, but maybe always one at each kind of stage of life. So for me, kind of getting into computing in the first place, my mum was quite a key person in that, because she was the one that put the computer together when we were at home, when we had like one computer in the house. Yeah, I'm not old now. So like kind of my mum, and then just kind of through the ages, when I was at school, I had a really great IT teacher, really good computing teacher at college, some amazing tutors in undergraduate, and yeah, my supervisors now, and even it's still kind of meeting people that are really inspiring and supportive in the sector. So yeah, I feel quite lucky in the fact that there's quite a few key people that are out there that are supporting me and helping me. The kind of key thing that I would, what was it? Sorry, the second part of the question, Karen.
Your advice for somebody else, what's that thing that you would tell to somebody else about, secret ways in which the world works?
Well, that's a tough one. I'd probably just say kind of stick at it. I think that's probably quite boring or hard one, but there are kind of some really kind of tricky periods in your career, and I found it quite tricky at points, being quite one of a minority in the field at some points, and especially when I was a software engineer and etc. So I think just kind of go for it and really kind of pursue your interests, because yeah, we need more people in the sector that are going to go for things that they enjoy, and looking at exciting things like sustainability and society, and like what people have been talking about today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's a brilliant answer. Karen, can I come to you now?
Yeah, I'm going to cheat slightly and use two names.
Okay.
Yes, so I was very privileged to work with Muffy Calder for many years at Glasgow University, and she was a great mentor, even though maybe she didn't realize she was mentoring me. She wasn't officially my mentor, but I learned an incredible amount from her about how the world works. And the other person is Professor Susan Waldron, who was in from geography at Glasgow University, who also just really gave me a steer in many right directions, not in terms of computing or my research, but really in terms of academia as a whole. So those two people played a key role, really. But I was actually going to exactly what Kelly just said, stick at it. I have experienced such great, incredible generosity from the most, people that I didn't even think would want to help me. And don't let people put you down, because just if somebody won't be generous, just move on, because there are many people who will, if you just ask, will be so willing to give you advice. And I think that's, take advice, but don't get don't get disheartened if somebody is a bit mean to you. That's their problem, that's not your problem.
Very nice. Thank you. Yes, Muffy Calder is also my mentor. That's who was my PhD supervisor. And finally, Lynn. Inspirational figure from your own background, and what tip would you pass on to help someone understand how the world works?
Yes, I think I also very much agree with what Kelly said, that at every stage there was one or several people who, sort of took you seriously and sort of supported you, sometimes supported you also unconditionally. That's really important, to sometimes have people who really, push you and trust you. But also not only senior mentors. I think what's really important, or what's important for me, is peers. So people who study with you, PhD students around you. Like at every stage, I feel like I almost learned most of what I learned from my peers, and that's the generation you're gonna work with when you do stuff, right? And they maybe have the fresh mind that you have, and also go different ways, and get together with them, and also sometimes who could be your biggest rival can also be your biggest collaborator, and can do great things together with you, right? So I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, to take the people around you seriously as well.
That's lovely. I think ending on that note of collaboration is a very nice place to finish off, because actually if we all work together more, then we probably actually get more stuff done. Fantastic. Thank you very much, all three of you. That's been a really rewarding afternoon, I think. I've certainly enjoyed it, and I can see there's lots of comments in the chats that suggest that all our audience have enjoyed that as well. There's still some more questions to answer as well. We don't have time to do everything, unfortunately. I think it's time for me to say thank you very much to everybody who has participated today. Thank you very much for the people who behind the scenes have done all the organisation. So in the BCS, that's Olivia Wolfhart and Pam Fegan. Thank you for everything you've done to help keep this on track. That's been amazing. Thank you to our speakers today, who have been outstanding. Really enjoyed that. I just wanted to mention a couple of things about what happens next. The audience will all get a little survey to ask them about what they thought about this, and try and harvest your ideas for how we would develop the Karen Spärck Jones lecture in the future. But in case you are looking for things that you can contribute to yourselves, or to listen to get more information, I'm going to recommend two podcasts. There's a BCS podcast called The Gem of All Mechanisms, and there's some fantastic episodes on there with some wonderful men and women in tech. Also the Suffrage Science podcast, and that is specifically about women in sciences. So not just tech, but all sciences. Really inspirational women on there as well. And if you are a young woman who is studying computing or a computing related subject in university, then BCS Lovelace Colloquium is coming up on the 13th of April. If you haven't already signed up to attend, then please do. I have put the links for that in the chat. It would be awesome to see you there, and get to hear from more exciting women. Okay, I'm going to turn to Olivia now and say, Olivia, is there anything I have forgotten?
No, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Karen, for chairing today.
Thank you. Let me say thank you all again. And I would give you a big virtual round of applause. You can imagine that I'm the whole of the audience clapping, right? It was amazing. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
And me, thank you. Thank you, everyone.